Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm Judy Zukreski, the Vice President of Global Services for the International Code Council. I hope everyone's having a great experience at our annual conference this year, especially reconnecting in person after a long time with colleagues new and old, and hopefully making lots of new connections. Before we get started, I am happy to let you know that we are offering ICC CEUs for attending this workshop. You'll be able to sign in after the session in the back of the room during the networking portion. And as long as you do that, our training department will email you the CEU confirmations once they manually input them, probably next week. On behalf of all of us at the International Code Council, I'd like to welcome you to the 2022 Global Building Safety Dialogue. We're so excited to have you all join us for this reimagined event on the important and timely topic of exploring how we learn from tragic events and what we might think about doing differently. I'm very excited about today's program, but before we dive in, I'd like to introduce Cindy Davis, President of the ICC Board of Directors, to welcome all of you.
Thank you, Judy, and good afternoon, everyone. As I shared at the ABM yesterday morning, one of the striking realities that I took away from my interactions with the building safety professionals from around the world is that we all face similar challenges. And it doesn't matter what codes we are enforcing, the challenges remain the same. That's part of the reason that I'm very excited about the topic of today's Global Building Safety Dialogue. Catastrophic building failures unfortunately happen around the world, and one of the challenges that we face as building safety professionals is to learn from the tragedy of those incidents and make smart changes that will successfully address the underlying or systemic causes of each incident. Today's session will be both timely and globally relevant. Thank you all for joining us to participate in the dialogue. The other reason I am excited about today's topic is our keynote speaker, Jill Kernick. Her book, Catastrophe, is well-researched, insightful, and moving. I'm thrilled that she was willing to travel from London to be with us for a few days this week, and especially to share her insights with us and participate in the dialogue. And now, I would like to welcome Jeff Mitchell, Chair of the Global Membership Council. The Global Membership Council is one of 5 membership councils sponsored by the International Code Council. The focus of the Global Membership Council is connecting building safety professionals from outside the United States with US-based professionals who have an interest in advancing the cause of building safety internationally. The Global Membership Council is helping to expand our role as the global leader in building safety, including supporting the Global Building Dialogue every year. Jeff, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, President Davis. Good afternoon, everyone, and I echo the comments that President Davis just made about the importance of the global dialogue. Every year, as I witness the expansion of ICC's global presence and thought leadership, I'm grateful to be an active member of this association. Thank you, Cindy, for your leadership and especially for your active support of all the ICC's global initiatives for this past year. Events like the Global Building Safety Dialogue are important opportunities for us to focus on the crucial global matters that impact all of us, and which different jurisdictions with different regulatory ecosystems, different forms of government oversight, we all approach differently. There's not any magic solution or approach that will prevent a tragedy with any absolute certainty, because buildings don't exist in a vacuum. There are external factors that cannot always be controlled. However, some systems and approaches have worked better than others, and through open dialogue with counterparts from around the world, we can sometimes arrive at best practices. Today, we aim to strengthen industry relationships and learn from one another so that we may improve and benefit. After a 2-year hiatus being locked in my own country due to closed borders, as you probably gathered, I'm not from the US. It's been great to connect this week with old friends and colleagues and to make new connections. And I look forward to continuing to do that today through this workshop. Thank you all for attending. Judy.
Thank you, Cindy and Jeff. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. I've had the pleasure of working with Jill Kernick over the past several months as we've prepared this workshop, and I'm very excited about what is in store for all of you today. Recognized as one of the UK's most influential voices in health and safety, Jill Kernick is an expert in developing the leadership and organizational culture needed to prevent catastrophic events. Jill's book, Catastrophe and Systemic Change, Learning from the Grenfield Tower Fire and Other Disasters, draws from her own experience of consulting organizations in high-hazard industries, combined with the deeply personal perspectives as a former resident of Grenfield Towers from 2011 to 2014. 7 of her immediate neighbors from the 21st floor were among the 72 people who tragically lost their lives on the 14th of June, 2017. In April of this year, Jill joined Arup, a global sustainable development consultancy, as the transformation director within their Center of Excellence, Arup University. She has already inspired and guided colleagues through the design and launch of a new 3-year global skills transformation program. This ambitious, transformative program will ensure that the firm continues to build its expertise needed to create a sustainable future. Jill also serves on the UK's Health and Safety Executive Shadow Resident Advisory Panel and the BSI Competence in the Built Environment Panel. If you have not already read her book, you will probably want to after this workshop, and it's easiest to buy it from Amazon or from a local bookstore. Jill donates 100% of the proceeds to charities that are selected by survivors of the Grenfell Tower fire each year. For now, please join me in welcoming Jill Kernick.
So thank you, everybody, and particularly Cindy, Jeff, and Judy, who I've loved working with over the last couple of months. It's truly an honour to be speaking to you today. I want to start in the same place that I will end, in a regular building in West London. I steel myself as the guards guide me through the security checks. It is the last day of the Grenfell inquiry hearings. This final module sets out the individual circumstances surrounding each death. I'm here to attend the hearings of my former neighbours, the Al-Wahhabis. They all died in their home, flat 182 on the 21st floor. Abdulaziz's sister Hanan lived on the 9th floor and escaped from the tower with her husband and 2 children. The conditions on floor 21 were rapidly deteriorating and changing, and it's against that backdrop that we hear about the numerous emergency calls that were made and the advice given to stay in their flat and wait for the fire service. One call to a control room operator lasted for 59 minutes. Beginning at 1:38, less than an hour after the fire started, the operator repeatedly tells the family to stay in their flat, saying that the firefighters would be coming soon and would have oxygen. As the conditions worsen, she tells them to close windows, cover their faces, and move to the bedroom. Just after 2:22, the control room operator was told by the family that the fire was in the corridor of the flat and that the smoke was coming into the bedroom. She told the family to cover their mouths and to get as close to the floor as they could. In another call, at 2:47, the family say they are now under the bed. Nehuda says, "We are dying and we can't get out." They are told the fire service is on its way. Abdulaziz says, "I could have got out a long time ago. We could have, but they said, stay in the flat, stay in the flat. We stayed in the flat. We didn't leave." In the final calls with the control room, the family are advised to leave, but they say it is too late, as there is too much smoke and they cannot breathe. According to the archaeological records, they all died in one of the bedrooms. They were lying close together. Juxtaposed with these calls, outside the tower, Hanan and other members of her family were having desperate calls with the Al-Wahhabis, pleading with them to get out. They stood outside the tower, watching the horror of the spreading flames. They could see Abdulaziz and his family inside their flat at the windows. According to protocols, Flat 182 should have been a priority for evacuation, as it was known that there were children present. There were no firefighter crews deployed or making it to that floor. In the words of Counsel, Mary Monroe, one branch of the family survived: Hanan, her husband, and her children. They did not make any emergency calls. They evacuated and survived. They live to mourn and question why. I struggle to reconcile the faith the Al-Wahhabis placed in the control room operators' advice, listening to them over their own family. That afternoon has changed me in ways I do not yet understand. It has made me think very differently about the burden of leadership, about the advice we give and the decisions we take, about the very real consequences of our failure to learn from tragic events. This dialogue today about learning from disasters could not be more important. My wish is that this session sparks kernels of thoughts and ideas that after we leave, flower and bloom in unexpected ways. My hope is that you are left with insights as to why we're failing globally to prevent disasters, an increased awareness of our moral obligation as leaders to influence new ways of thinking and give voice to those that are currently not heard, and leave with some new questions and thoughts about what might be done differently. I am far from an expert in building codes. What I'm interested in is the regulatory and building system as a whole, and how this audience and organizations such as the ICC can enable change, whether through writing code, influencing stakeholders and governments, enabling different dialogues, or upgrading competency across the industry. It's not my intent to present my views as the truth. They are offered in the spirit of inquiry and to spark debate. I have a bias to the UK, for which I beg forgiveness up front. I'm going to reflect on 4 questions. Why does our failure to learn make sense? How can we explore systemic change? Will the global response to facade fires lead to systemic change? And where can we find hope? As I watched Grenfell burn, I promised to make sure we learned from it. But it soon became clear that to fulfill that promise, I would first need to understand our inability to learn more generally. In the months after the fire, I devoured information. One Saturday, I read evidence presented to a government select committee investigating a fire that had killed disabled resident Alexander Linton. The primary risk, therefore, of a cladding system is that of providing a vehicle for assisting uncontrolled fire spread up the outer face of a building, with the strong possibility of the fire re-entering the building. This was from June 1999, 18 years before Grenfell. I sobbed when I read that evidence. There had been multiple opportunities to learn from facade fires, both in the UK and globally. The Lakanal house fire that killed 6 people, including 20-day-old Michelle Odoko, had clear lessons on the dangers of facade fire spread and of the dangers of control room operators giving advice that firefighters were on the way when this might not be the case. But we did not learn. The 2016 London Fire Brigade presentation, Tall Building Facades, had at most been seen by 1 person on the ground at Grenfell. Evidence suggested, in the wake of Grenfell, we would conduct lengthy investigations and make piecemeal changes that would improve safety, but we would fail to enable systemic change, to alter the culture and mindsets in a meaningful way. And in decades to come, after some other disaster, the narrative would be, we did not learn from Grenfell. There is an awful sameness to disasters, whether a high-rise fire, a building collapse, or a pandemic. There are persistent lessons across disasters and across geographies that we are failing to meaningfully alter. For example, regarding facade fires, the Shergold Weir report in Australia raises similar issues to the Hacked report in the UK. In the immediate aftermath of a disaster, there is understandably an obsession with what went wrong and a fixation on finding a root cause and who to blame. But these narratives can inhibit our ability to learn. This failure, in my view, is inextricably linked with our failure to view low probability risks distinctly, to embrace complexity, or differentiate between piecemeal and systemic change. So let's look at these in turn. As I watched Grenfell burn, given my work in high hazard industries, I kept thinking of the UK's largest industrial disaster, Piper Alpha. 169 people were killed when the oil and gas platform was destroyed following the ignition of a low-lying cloud of condensate, when a pump under maintenance was started. Weak shift-over practices meant the crew did not know that the pressure safety valve had been removed and replaced with a blank flange that was not leak-tight. Firewalls failed to contain the fire and keep those mustering safe. At no point was there any systematic attempt to lead men to escape from the accommodation block. A total of 61 men from the platform survived, many reaching the sea using ropes and hoses or jumping off the platform. Guidance said to do so meant certain death. At a very human level, when I visited the Piper Memorial in Aberdeen, the awful sameness of the family tragedy hit me, as shared surnames, as in Grenfell, tell the story of lost fathers and sons and uncles. but it is one of Lord Cullen's conclusions in the investigation into Piper that is of particular interest: the failure of owner Occidental and the regulators to systematically address remote but potentially hazardous events, so-called low probability, high consequence events. Piper led to the introduction of safety cases and assessing these major risks distinctly in the UK oil and gas industry. A similar approach is being adopted post-Grenfield. The slide on the screen now is indicative of how the oil and gas industry thinks about these events. You cannot manage high probability, lower consequence events, sometimes called slips, trips, and falls, in the same way you manage a catastrophic fire. You will not stop a plane falling out the sky by managing that a baggage handler does not strain his back. I wonder what this thinking looks like for the built environment, where maintenance issues are seen as weak signals, or cracks in a bridge are viewed as a potential precursor to a major disaster. The low probability nature makes them difficult to measure and manage. But we must fight narratives such as "we'll be fine," and we must explore worst case scenarios, actively practicing chronic unease, imagining and then mitigating against the worst thing that could go wrong. Our failure to think about low probability events distinctly is perhaps linked to a failure to embrace complexity. In the months after Grenfell, I was really fortunate to be mentored by a retired NASA astronaut, Captain Jim Weatherby. One day, when all the traditional and expected routes for change felt impossible, he said to me, "The doors of the people who should be talking to you will be closed. Stop knocking on them. Look for the open doors." This took me out of linear thinking and helped me develop my capability to navigate and lead in complex environments. I have learned that systemic change requires disruption, that I need to shift how I think and how I act. I have come to see that kindness can be more disruptive than aggression, that compassion can be more impactful than taking positions. Some characteristics of complex systems are that change is emergent, interactions are non-linear, and minor changes have major consequences. Complex systems are not predictable. Cause and effect are not tightly coupled. We cannot predict outcomes or retrospectively assign cause. They involve a large number of interacting elements with distributed control, and they're adaptive and co-evolve. It often feels as if our response to disasters attempts to impose bureaucratic, linear, command and control thinking and solutions on a complex world. I worry that we're creating regulations, codes, and solutions that assume linearity and tightly coupled cause and effect relationships. As supply chains and delivery streams get more complex, adding increasing numbers of interacting elements and players with distributed control, the cause-effect relationship is likely to become more obtuse. Is this going to weaken the impact, particularly of prescriptive regulations? We must build our competency to operate in complex domains if we're to succeed at creating a resilient built environment. Professor Jose Terrero, who many of you will know of, in a 2018 speech at the Warren Centre in Australia said, "So we have created a system that is way too complex for our current definition of competency. We have created a system that creates too much ambiguity to be consistent with our current definition of competency." Perhaps this failure to develop the competency to navigate complexity and its inherent ambiguity drives us towards piecemeal change. Piecemeal change solves an issue with part of a system and is accessed by asking what is wrong. It relies on technical expertise and assumes a controllable and predictable world. The leadership style tends towards command and control and rules-based methods. Systemic change is concerned with shifting the conditions that are holding problems in place. It assumes the world is complex and requires organic, principle-based leadership. Rather than look for what's wrong, which drives piecemeal thinking, it assumes that the system is functioning perfectly. This allows a more holistic view. Systemic change requires both experimentation and disruption and demands a different way of leading. Most of our responses to disasters are piecemeal. For example, with regards building materials post-Grenfell, a piecemeal approach might control what specific materials are used and improve testing and product classification. Or, as in the case of the UK, prescribe regular inspections of fire doors in high-rise residential buildings. Whereas a systemic approach based on what has emerged in the Grenfell inquiry in the UK would require grappling with issues such as the role of political lobbying, the independence of self-funding testing bodies, and the pressure to introduce sustainable materials whose performance is not yet understood. Piecemeal change is critical to safety, but on its own, it's insufficient. It will not shift the enduring issues we find in disaster after disaster, of warning signals not heeded, of voices not heard, of unchecked biases and weak leadership. To tackle the awful sameness of disasters, we need a way to explore and understand systemic change. A fish is swimming along one day when another fish comes along and says, "Hey, how's the water?" The first fish stares blankly at the second fish and then says, "What's water?" The fish parable illustrates why systemic change can be so challenging. It requires that we reveal and shift the conditions holding problems and issues in place. As a first step, that we make the water visible, or illuminate the systemic forces at play and grapple with this messy kaleidoscope of factors. In the wake of Grenfell, and to help me understand why our failure to learn makes sense, I created a model for systemic change, a framework for making the water visible. There are 4 core aspects divided into governing and operating frameworks. The foundational elements are things that we put in place to prevent catastrophic outcomes, such as regulations, codes, guidance, governance processes. We then put behavioral mechanisms in both to prevent and respond to disasters. Preventative mechanisms include inspections, plan review. Reactive mechanisms include investigations and litigation. Relational elements explore how softer issues contribute to disasters. For example, speaking truth to power or regulatory capture. And finally, we look at the contextual aspects that impact our ability to prevent and learn from disasters, such as culture, bias, and trust. The foundational and behavioral aspects are obvious. They are where we usually focus after a disaster, whereas the relational and contextual aspects are not often explored in depth, and it is in these domains that many of the enduring issues exist. As an illustration, here are some of the broad factors that were in play at Grenfell. We begin to see many commonalities to other disasters, such as the Boeing 737 MAX crashes or the 2018 Florida International University pedestrian bridge collapse. The model is useful to make the water visible, but also to help explore the issues such as myths and the conditions holding our inability to learn in place, and to use this to reveal ways to positively disrupt the status quo. There's insufficient time to go through a full analysis, but I will share some of the myths that I think are in the way of our learning. In 1666, the Great Fire of London destroyed a quarter of the city. Official accounts say that only 6 people died, but some view that as an underestimation. There had been warnings that London would be destroyed by a fire due to the narrow streets and overhanging wooden houses. In 1605, King James ordered all new houses to be made from brick or stone. Uptake was slow, and many ignored the order. In 1667, the Act for the Rebuilding of the City of London was introduced, stating that the outside of all buildings be made of brick or stone. 10 years later, a terrible fire claimed 20 people south of the Thames. The lessons of the Great Fire of London had little effect. The area was still made up of old timber-framed buildings and narrow streets. In the face of disasters, there is enormous pressure on those in power to be seen to be doing something, and regulation is an obvious place to turn to. It feels sometimes as if our response has not changed significantly since the 1600s. And it is a myth that regulations guarantee safe outcomes. Regulations are reactive. Not all regulations and codes are good. Dealing with historic failures is difficult. Blind compliance can in fact increase risk. The nature of risk is changing. Regulations are only one input into a complex socio-technical system, and regulatory vulnerabilities are increasing. We operate inside of a myth of this perfect error-free world. But error is normal, and in fact, uninteresting in terms of disasters. Mistakes and errors happen all the time, and mostly without incident. It is mythical thinking to assume that every time people make a mistake or don't follow a code, it ends in disaster. Inside this paradigm of thinking, our attention is on the people making errors, and our response to failure is often to add more bureaucracy and guidance to control behaviors. But this can have unintended consequences. For example, it can inhibit our ability to predict events or search for failures, as the focus is on compliance, not searching for vulnerabilities. Numbers games and compliance metrics are often fudged to produce the right-looking dashboards and can drive tick box approaches. An additive approach to rules and guidance can become overwhelming and drive more violations. Research in Australia found that more than 600 rules applied to the work of a ward nurse. On average, they could recite fewer than 3 of these rules, but for the most part, work got done and patients were fine. The world does not operate perfectly according to our imagined or prescribed worlds of codes and regulations. A code does not work unless it is appropriate to the context, applied, agile, and understood through all stages of a building life cycle. In my own experience, there is often more focus on demonstrating compliance at the end of a project rather than fulfilling the intent of the code behind it every day. If we're serious about preventing disasters, we need to explore the difference between work as imagined, prescribed, done, and disclosed. This would require learning from those at the sharp end of work and busting the myth that softer relational issues are not that important. Narratives such as rebel resident were used at Grenfield to silence those raising concerns before the fire. A theme I come back to again and again is one of power, of whose lives matter and whose voices count. Again and again, we see how perceived pressure and personal relationships drive behaviors such as regulatory capture and groupthink, and how warning signals from those at the coalface are so often ignored, from Grenfield to Surfside to the Miami, Florida pedestrian bridge collapse. This is common across disasters. The morning of the Florida bridge collapse, the engineer of record held a meeting after acknowledging that his computations could not replicate the cracks, and he did not know why they were occurring. Despite being advised that the cracks were lengthening daily, he stated that they did not present any safety concerns. At approximately 1:45, the pedestrian building under construction collapsed. 1 employee and 5 motorists were fatally injured. Last weekend, I read of a mother who repeatedly raised concerns to medical staff about her daughter. They ignored her until it was too late. Her daughter died of sepsis. I cannot stress enough how critical diversity in decision-making is, how the tacit knowledge of those at the coalface is often a missing voice, how the arrogance of expertise can be dangerous, how burdensome the advice we give is. We need to work out how to include the voice of the supervisor who is deciding to block a fire exit in a clothing factory. Do we understand why these decisions make sense to them? Where is the voice of the workers who sleep and work and eat in overcrowded buildings designed for different purposes? I am in awe of the public hearings you do here and will be attending for the first time tomorrow. Anything that we can do to bring diverse voices into these conversations is a step towards goodness. Let us turn to the final myth, that we can create systemic change without shifting deeply held assumptions and beliefs. Our biases are embedded in the environment we build. For example, the formula to determine standard office temperature was developed in the 1960s around the metabolic resting rate of the average man. Recent research shows that the metabolic rate of a young adult female is significantly lower. Most PPE is based on the sizes and characteristics of male populations in Europe and the United States. We use red as a signal of danger, but in China, red means luck. We use green as a sign to follow, but in some South American countries, it means death. To enable systemic change, we need to explore how our assumptions and beliefs impact on our decisions. Many disasters are not unpredicted, from Katrina to the pandemic to climate change. It is not that they are unpredictable, but our failure to act proactively. That is the issue. We need to guard against and counter biases such as willful blindness and optimism bias. Have we confronted the worst case scenarios of predicted megatrends, such as increasing urbanization, aging populations, and increasing inequality? Are we designing and writing code that will ensure resilience to these worst-case scenarios? We must fight narratives such as we'll be fine or nothing will go wrong. Our ability to learn from disasters is inextricably linked with our ability to embrace systemic change and openly explore and understand the myths we hold that inhibit progress. Let me now turn to the global response to Facade fires. Evidence suggests that the rate of external wall system cladding fires has been steadily increasing, with some research indicating a 7-fold increase over the last decade. My colleagues Susan Lamont and Li-Hu Liu have recently written a paper that considers how different countries have responded to combustible cladding. This shows both similarities and differences in response. The USA has not seen the same severity or amount of facade fires. Do we understand why? Is the more prescriptive nature of regulations at play? The ICC, whose codes are adopted in other countries, responded by providing clarification documents and simplifications, and updates were made to the IBC, but they were not fundamentally changed. In the UK and Australia, who have both have outcomes-based regulatory approaches and more facade fires, there's been a move to a more prescriptive approach regarding using only non-combustible materials in external wall systems, particularly on high-rise residential buildings. In the UK, phase 1 of the Grenfield inquiry found the external wall cladding failed to meet the functional requirements of the regulations to adequately resist the spread of fire. The UK has made many regulatory reforms based on both this and the Hackett Report, including a new regulatory framework for high-rise residential buildings that sees a new regulator, gateway paths and safety cases to strengthen regulatory oversight, a golden thread of information, clear duty holders and responsibilities throughout a building's life cycle. In addition, there's a new regulator for product safety. Australia, with similar issues to the UK, including failures in competence and regulatory oversight, amended codes to clarify the definition of external wall system, new fire testing was introduced, and some prescriptive elements were added, such as non-combustible external wall systems on buildings over 2 stories. Sprinklers have been mandated, and a remediation program was set up in some states. Singapore has implemented stricter certification and labeling for composite panels, including inspection of manufacturing processes, quality audits of factory management systems, and testing of cladding samples on sites. Certificates are only issued to Singapore-registered companies by local certification bodies, which allows the Singapore Civil Defence Force to directly act against those who supply non-compliant fire safety products for use in Singapore. It's now both an offence to supply and install non-compliant fire safety products. In 2018, the UAE, which has had several cladding fires, introduced the need for certification and civil defence approvals for all materials in external wall systems. The design must be submitted to the civil defence for approval prior to construction, and a civil defence approved third party must be appointed to inspect construction at 20%, 40%, 60%, 80%, and 100%. These responses will make buildings safer, and as such, are critical. I suspect there is a lot for the UK to learn from places like America, UAE, and Singapore around enforcement and inspection. But I am not hopeful that these responses will lead to systemic change. Regarding the UK, overall, I suspect our approach to regulation is simplistic. We swing from outcome-based to prescription. Are we caught in a cycle where in the immediate aftermath of a disaster, there's a push for prescriptive regulations, but then pressure around the burden of regulation and need for innovation from business leads to a swing in the other direction? It is yet to be seen whether the safety case regime will deliver. It could radically change the mindset of those in industry. It could also bury industry in a pile of bureaucracy. A lot will depend on the power and resourcing of the regulator. Globally, I see little that is improving our capability to deal with complexity and ambiguity. We seem to be relying on traditional regulatory mechanisms that do not pay enough attention to context. Are our regulatory responses, guidance, and codes easy to implement in emerging markets? Are they resilient to climate change, to different levels of competence and understanding? Do they rely on good maintenance and operation to avoid disasters? There is some hope regarding systemic change when we look at fairly born consequences for remediation. Dealing with historic failures is always problematic, and we will hear more about this in the New Zealand leaky building case later. The UK is moving its way to move the burden from leaseholders to developers and others in the built environment. It should be said, though, that this is because of years of political lobbying and campaigning by those impacted rather than a proactive response from government. Regarding whose voices count, there has been a move in the UK at least to amplifying residents' voices. For example, the new regulator has a statutory resident advisory panel. My issue is that without concurrently shifting the narrative and biases that inhibit valuing diverse voices, the impact of these bodies will be limited. When I look at the UK and global response, they will make buildings safer, but I am not hopeful they will lead to systemic change, to resilience to future disasters beyond just facade fires, to tackling the awful sameness of the persistent lessons we fail to impact. Which takes me to my final section, hope. But before I get there, here is a brief summary of what we've covered. We've looked at why our failure to learn makes sense, how we can explore systemic change, and whether our global response will lead to systemic change. Now to hope. My journey post-Grenfell has been one of despair and hope. I adored living there. My memories are of the sounds of children playing in the lift lobby and the unimaginably exquisite sunsets. I have been horrified and left despairing at the racist attacks on the community. The worst being the emergence of a YouTube video of a group burning an effigy of Grenfell just over a year after the fire. I struggle to understand the context surrounding this, as I imagine people taking the time to make the model, add a label, Grenfield Tower, and then laugh and joke as they watch it burn. I have despaired at the lack of trustworthiness of institutions and governments and organizations as the gut-wrenching revelations of the inquiry have unfolded over the last years. I have despaired at how the risk is being borne so unequally and how those most vulnerable are most exposed, and increasingly so as the impacts of climate change are so apocalyptically being felt. At times, it has been hard to move beyond despair. But I have found hope in unexpected places, two of which I'll share with you: grief and the democratization of change. We talk too little about the transformative power of grief, of the power and resilience and determination of those most impacted by disasters, of the ability of those who lost their homes and loved ones to drive change, but also of the grief of those, like me, and like many of you, who are on the margins of disaster and whose souls are touched in ways that compel action and change. Grief that gives courage and wisdom and an unrelenting drive for progress. Recent research found that disaster managers felt that loss and suffering were not well understood. The same research found that the leadership traits most needed after disasters were those of compassion and kindness and courage and wisdom. I have found hope in many interactions, many with people I have never met, that have demonstrated those leadership traits and touched my heart forever. I wonder if there is more that we could do to build these characteristics and develop our capacity for a new way of leading. Eddie DeFarn, the Grenfield survivor who campaigned for change prior to the fire and was labelled a rebel resident, said in his evidence in the inquiry, "They didn't treat us with respect or empathy or humanity. And if they had, I wouldn't be sitting here now." I would encourage us to talk more openly about grief and understand its transformative power and develop our ability for a new way of leading. In my book, I talk about what I call the democratization of change, of how increasing complexity has given us all the opportunity and perhaps duty to contribute significantly to learning and preventing disasters. I no longer believe it is the sole remit of governments to drive change. We have a responsibility too. As complexity expert Dave Snowden says, if you want to change things, you have to let 1,000 flowers bloom. Some will thrive, some will not. You cannot determine in advance what will work. You want a wildflower meadow, not a formal garden. We can all be disruptive seed planters and gardeners in whatever way we can, and tiny step by tiny step, change will happen. I said at the beginning I was more interested in what happened after today, and my hope is that this session will spark kernels of thought that will grow and bloom in unexpected ways. You give me hope. That I am here gives me hope. That you chose to be here fills me with hope. I want to end by returning to the inquiry, to the images of the archaeological remains of families dying together, with the parents forming protective rings around their children. Ultimately, the effectiveness of codes and regulations is bounded by the soundness of the decisions we make and the moral leadership and courage we bring to making them. Here are the closing remarks of Counsel to the Inquiry, Richard Millett, that so eloquently capture the burden of our leadership. Every decision, every act, omission, interpretation, understanding, practice, policy, protocol affects someone somewhere, someone who is unknown and unseen, but who is an adored child, a beloved sister, a respected uncle, and a needed mother. May those words ring in our ears, and may the voices of those not here help us make better decisions. Thank you. You come up.
Thank you so much, Jill. We now have a few moments for questions from the floor, and I'd like to open the floor for questions. There's a microphone here. If you have a question, you can come up to the microphone, or you can raise your hand. We can bring the mic around, and I hope that you will. Please speak up and share your thoughts. I'll start us off. Based on what I've read in the press, most of the Grenfield Towers residents consisted of, most of Grenfield was subsidized housing. I know from talking to you that's not the case, but I'd like to sort of correct that here and get your thoughts about how residents of subsidized housing, or the fact that there were a lot of residents of subsidized housing in the Grenfield Towers, did that impact the ability, as you've said, of voices being heard? How big of a factor was that? And I'm going to invite you to come back here because and please, other people ask.
So a lot of the housing, they're housing blocks, so they're kind of called council housing blocks, so they're owned by local government. But over the years, some of those have moved into private ownership, so through a policy by a former government. So, for example, the flat that we sat in with Grenfield was privately owned, and we rented it from that owner. So it's a myth that all council housing, that all of the buildings are for council tenants. So we fell in love with high-rise living, so we bought an apartment in another famous modernist building called Leaky Tower. And in that building, I think there's maybe 15 to 20% are privately owned, and then the rest are council. And I do think we were talking about this yesterday, there's a power imbalance. So as a leaseholder, I have much more voice because they can't kick me out, right? I mean, they have real difficulties with that. So there's a lot of power issues when you look at that. And in Grenfield, not everybody actually that was raised, there were a number of leaseholders that were raising their voice as well. I just think you're less under threat if you're a leaseholder and raising voices.
Good afternoon. Is this on? Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. When you talk about doing what we can to bring about systemic change, what would you recommend in terms of addressing a problem that we all hear and you yourself deal with all the time? And that is that all too often you see people that are just so, they're focused on paying attention to things that only seem to affect them. We have terrible wildfires, and there are some people who say, yeah, that's not in my area. Let the folks in Colorado and Utah and Oregon and California deal with it. And then you have situations where you have dense housing. And folks say, well, I live out in the country. We don't have that. That's their problem. And I can go on and on and on. How do we go about encouraging folks to participate in bringing about this systemic change when we can see the problems, yet all too often the folks just push it off because it doesn't affect them?
Thanks for the question. So I obviously don't have an easy answer to it, but I do think that many of the issues that we're facing are existential in nature, and I don't think we spend enough time in existential conversations or developing our capability to lead, as I said during the talk, to lead in complex environments. So there's a demand for a different style of leadership that pulls for morality, frankly, where it's all our problem because there's a connection between us as humans versus my siloed worldview. But I don't think we have those conversations. So I think as a straight answer, I think we need to engage in more existential conversations. We need to get better at welcoming diverse views, at creating safe spaces for really deep dialogue. I don't think we do that enough. I think we're too afraid. So we just pretend it's not going on and move on.
First of all, thank you for your presentation. You alluded to some differences between the UK and Australia and the US, and I think most of the people in the room would realize that there are prohibitions against combustible cladding. In your deep dive in the research, your unfortunate research to the tragedy, we know that the cause was the combustible cladding. You alluded to residents talking to the control room, I believe it was, or the controller. If you can provide some more insight to what that is that like a 911 dispatcher?
Yeah, fire service, yeah.
Dispatcher, and based upon your evidence review at the inquiry, even though the smoke and the fire was severe later and caused significant egress problems, did the inquiry indicate whether a rapid, immediate evacuation would have drastically reduced the fatalities?
So I don't want to misquote the evidence, so just to caveat what I'll say, but so firstly in the UK is a policy called stay put, which is
That's what I wanted you
yeah,
to say.
which is when you're in a high-rise residential building, unless you're immediately impacted by the fire, you stay in your flat. Now, I stay in a block with stay put, and it's fine because we don't have external cladding. One of the findings from phase 1 of the Grenfield inquiry was that the fire service had stay put had become an article of faith. And there's, as with all accidents, there's these strange things that happen that contribute. So on the night of the fire, the control room operators were in temporary premises. And for whatever reason, they didn't have the TV on. So in a normal fire, you would expect stay put to work. So, but again, it goes back to the voices. So control room operators were getting calls. The fire spread up so quickly. And they were telling people on the top floors who were saying, there's fire outside my window. The control room operators were saying, no, the fire's on floor 4. You're fine, stay put.
But that stay in place or shelter in place, that is an official policy?
It's an official policy, but there should be a backup plan to evacuate if needed. Hence, so from a mindset perspective, what Moorbeck, who's the chair of the Grenfield inquiry, said is that stay put had become an article of faith. So the fire service just went, well, we just stay put. And it took Andy Rowe, who's now the new London Fire Brigade Commissioner, when he took over, I can't recall the hours, as soon as he took over, he changed the stay put policy.
So
but yes, there is evidence.
Evacuate, okay.
Exactly. And there is evidence, there is some expert evidence that at any point people could have evacuated.
Which would have significantly
Which would have
reduced
significantly.
Thank you.
So,
Thank you so
yeah.
much.
Good afternoon. Thank you for your time today. Very inspiring to rethink about how we approach disasters. As a code official, I've gone to a number of trainings, and one theme that sticks out time and again, and I'd like to hear your perspective on, is it's never one error. It's never one point of failure. It's multifaceted. There are many different things that go wrong to have something be this tragic, and I wonder how that fits in the model that you've talked about approaching issues. Does that ring true to you still, or do you think that approach or that thought that, oh, it has to be multiple failures for something to be this bad, prevents us from making the changes we need to make?
Sorry, say the last bit again.
Do you think that idea that it has to be multiple failures to be this tragic prevents us or hinders us from making changes?
So are you aware of the Swiss cheese model?
Yes.
Yeah. So thanks for the question. So I think the problem with Swiss cheese, which I actually use in my book because I think it's a useful demonstration of layers of protection and multiple failures, which it's not so much they have to be present as evidence shows they are present, is that when you look at disasters, it's never a single source, there's always multiple. But the problem with models like Swiss cheese is they're not linear. So that kind of shows, Swiss cheese kind of portrays this narrative of there's kind of some linearity to the failures, where actually there isn't a linearity to the failures. If you look at Grenfield, the failures started way back with, decisions or failures to upgrade codes, to not listening to residents, etc., etc. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but that's my immediate reflection on it. Yeah. All right. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone, and thanks once again, Jill. You going to stay here? Am I staying? Yes, you're staying here. Yes, stay. Next on our program, we're moving to a panel discussion on different types of actual building disasters and looking at the responses in the aftermath and their suitability. I'll go ahead and introduce our panelists to you as we're getting set up, and then I'll turn it back over to Jill to have some moderation of the panel. Sergio can come up. Sergio Asensei is the Deputy Building Official of Miami-Dade County, where he helps oversee the construction, permitting, and building codes division, the building department, operating out of the Permitting and Inspection Center for the unincorporated Miami-Dade County area. If you want to sit down, I'm going to introduce everybody first. You can sit here. He was recently charged with overseeing the building recertification program for the county. He's a civil engineer by education, a state licensed general contractor, and has over 30 years of experience as a code official in Florida. He served as president of the Building Officials Association of Florida, BOAF, as well as president of the local chapter of BOAF in Miami-Dade County. He's a member of the board of directors of the International Accreditation Service, a subsidiary of ICC, and he's currently serving on several committees, including the BOAF Legislative Committee and the Hurricane Research Advisory Committee to the Florida Building Commission. The second speaker on our panel is joining us virtually. Nick Hill is joining us by Zoom, and we'll have his picture appear when he's giving his presentation. Nick is the chief executive of the Building Officials Institute of New Zealand, or BOINS, which is the peak body representing the building surveying sector, which includes building controls, building inspection, and specialist property inspection. BOINS is dedicated to improving the quality and performance of the built environment. Nick is also the past president of the Australasian Society of Association Executives, with operations in both Australia and New Zealand, to support and enhance the value of the association sector and its executives. Nick has previously held general management and senior leadership roles within GEC New Zealand Limited and the Motor Trade Association of New Zealand, as well as industry representative, advisory, and chairing roles over a wide range of motor industry regulation and project areas. He was also a board member of the New Zealand Masonry Trades Registration Board Incorporated and chaired an industry group to standardize odometer certification for used imported vehicles into New Zealand. Nick's sector exposure includes industrial chemicals, illumination engineering, electrical wholesaling, construction, and the motor industry. Chris Ackerman, who is also joining us by Zoom, is currently a director of transportation and vertical structures at the Millennium Challenge Corporation, or MCC, an innovative and independent U.S. foreign assistance agency that's helping to lead the fight against global poverty. In his role, Chris oversees the scope, cost, and schedule aspects of the planning, design, construction, and maintenance of buildings and other structures funded through MCC programs worldwide. Prior to joining MCC in 2016, Chris was a capital program manager in the Office of Science within the U.S. Department of Energy, as a design team leader and project manager for HDR Architecture Incorporated, and as an officer in the U.S. Army. Chris is passionate about the intersections of infrastructure design and construction, international development, and project management. He's a licensed professional engineer in Maryland and Virginia, and a certified project management professional. He has a Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering and Operations Research from Princeton, and a Master of Science in Civil and Environmental Engineering, and a Master of Science degree in Building Technology, both from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Jill's joining the panel also to provide some additional reflections about the Grenfield Towers fire, as well as recent updates on the public inquiry and changes to the building regulatory system in the UK. We're going to now ask Sergio to start us off, followed by Nick, Chris, and then Jill. Sergio, please.
Thank you, Judy. All right, let's see. Am I hitting the right button? The green one, yeah. Okay, there we go. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Surfside is one of those tragedies that a community would never imagine happening. While the building itself is shared of maintenance issues, we would never think that it could just collapse the way it did. So in this presentation, we'll take a quick look at the milestone inspection process of Miami-Dade County, the building assessment by an engineering firm of Champlain Towers South 3 years prior to the collapse, and photos of the collapse under a search and rescue post-Surfside changes of the milestone inspection program in Florida, and some takeaways from such an incident. We're not going to take a look at, cover speculations as to what triggered the collapse or what kind of code changes are needed, as the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, has not concluded their investigation yet. Well, the town of Surfside is one of those municipalities in Miami-Dade County where the Champlain Towers South resided. This is the original site showing the entire property, the building, the pool deck, the pool, and of course, this is next to the ocean, Atlantic Ocean. On June 24th, 2021, at about 1:25 a.m., tragedy struck. Run the video. So the collapse was captured on security video from a nearby building. And I'm sure that most of you have already seen this video in the news in the past. And this was really one of the major evidence that we saw captured in the video. Okay. Thank you. So the collapse resulted in 98 fatalities. However, 102 occupants did manage to make it out of the building. And only a portion of that building had collapsed. There have been lots of speculations about what triggered the collapse. But to date, reasons remain unknown, as still NIST is still working on the forensics. So let's take a look at the milestone inspection requirements of Miami-Dade County, at the time known as the 40-year recertification program. Reactive to the incident of 1974, the recertification program was developed to inspect aging buildings in Miami-Dade County. At the time leased by the Drug Enforcement Administration, a portion of the building collapsed, killing 7 and injuring 16. The portion that collapsed was a rooftop parking area. In 1975, the Board of County Commissioners of the county adopted a new ordinance establishing the 40-year recertification program. 40 years was selected because the building had just turned 40 years old, and then subsequent inspections would occur every 10 years after that. The basic intent of the program was to get a set of trained eyes to inspect and determine how the building is aging, to identify any structural distress at the time, and then, if so, recommend repairs so that the building can continue to serve its purpose. Built in 1981, the Champlain Towers was due for the 40-year recertification in 2021. An engineering firm was hired in 2018 to perform a structural field survey of the building. The engineering firm reviewed architectural and structural documents provided by the city of Surfside. The purpose was to survey the entire building's condition to understand and document the extent of any structural issues, and provide a report and cost estimate of the repairs to the condominium board. The report observed significant stucco cracking in the exterior facade between the top of the concrete slab and the first course of masonry. And these are some excerpts from the actual report that was submitted. The pool deck and the entrance drive were observed with minor cracking at the planter knee walls. Joint seating was needed to be replaced at the pool deck, and waterproofing below the pool deck and entrance drive must be replaced. The failed pool deck waterproofing was causing major structural damage to the concrete slab below due to lack of drainage. Parking garage level had abundant cracking and spalling of various degrees of the columns, beams, and walls. Sizable spalling was noted on the top side of the entrance drive ramp and the underside of the pool entrance and the planter slabs. The report did not, however, make any conclusions as to the imminent failure of the building, other than raise concerns over the noted maintenance issues. The reported cost of repairs was upwards of $15 million at that time. The engineering firm was then hired in 2020 to come back and start the 40-year recertification process. At the time of the collapse, the roof repairs had gotten underway, but concrete restoration had not yet begun. In this photo, you can see the rear portion of the building that had collapsed. This is a view from the east or the ocean side, and you can see the debris pile was estimated to be about 4 stories high. There was an unprecedented number of task force deployment from all regions, national and international. Task Force 1 from Miami-Dade Fire, Task Force 2 from the City of Miami Fire, and Task Force 3 from the Tampa area, just to name a few, reported as the largest deployment outside of a natural disaster. And this photo shows the line of search and rescue workers at the collapse carefully removing debris. And the staging of debris on site as it was removed and hauled away. This is the view of the pancake type of collapse that made it very difficult to find survivors. The absence of voids also made it very difficult to survive such a collapse. Here's a side view from an adjacent building at the debris pile. The instability of the remaining building was holding back the search and rescue. The remainder of the building needed to be demolished. So at the time, impact from Tropical Storm Elsa was threatening the area. So a decision was made to implode the building on July 4th, 2021 at 10:30 p.m. This is the photo that I took just before the implosion of that building. The whole area was cordoned off, police presence, and I think at that point, the last sounding of the demolition horn was given. So remotely watching from the command center near the site, we'll start that video in a minute. The building was successfully imploded. Soon after, efforts transitioned to search and recovery. There are lots of speculations and theories as to what caused it. Sorry about that. There are many videos on social media that offer analysis and reasons why. NIST is currently working on determining what triggered the collapse, but unfortunately won't have that report for some time. They also collected structural samples that are being kept in a nearby warehouse for further analysis. So here's some gathered portions of the collapsed structure in a nearby warehouse in Miami-Dade County that are being held for further analysis. NIST hopes to gain knowledge of how these structural components were built and compare them to the engineering drawings and the codes at the time. The current site stands debris-free and only the basement slab exposed. It is still considered a demolition site until the basement slab is removed or is replaced by a building. Currently, there is an offer of $120 million from a developer to purchase the land, and there have also been recent court settlements as well. This photo shows remnants of the basement slab and the protruding columns that remain behind. It was actually in pretty fair condition. The basement walls adjacent to Collins Avenue, which is the thoroughfare fronting the property, were shored so that additional lanes of traffic could be opened. The site does get inundated with saline subsurface waters. A group of industry leaders gathered to discuss what can be done to prevent future tragedies such as this. The International Code Council, Building Officials Association of Florida, Building Owners and Managers Association, and the National Institute of Building Sciences held an industry meeting on August 17, 2021 in West Palm Beach. The focus was on how communities monitor the safety of existing buildings, what guidance exists for building owners, and how future catastrophic events can be avoided. The collapse set into motion changes to the recertification program in Miami-Dade County. Department staff, local building officials, and interested industry members met to discuss strengthening the program. Miami-Dade adopted a strengthened milestone inspection program that reduced the inspection cycle from the original 40 to now 30 years. Florida recently enacted a new law that created a milestone inspection program across the entire state. It is currently limited to only condominium and cooperative association buildings that are 3 stories or taller. Along with that, some of condominium law reforms included not being able to waive reserves and providing a reserve study every 10 years to make sure that maintenance reserve amounts were adequate to face any repairs necessary. In closing, a more in-depth study of an aging building structure may be warranted when there are signs of structural distress. Building maintenance on a regular basis is certainly a necessity. Don't wait until regulatory requirements tell you that an inspection is needed. Like the building code, milestone inspection regulations are minimum. We'll have to wait for the NIST report to disclose what may have triggered the collapse. At the time, recommendations for changes in structural design, codes, or inspections may be forthcoming. But with all that said, buildings just don't fail like this. Thank you.
So thanks very much. A couple of things strike me about it. Number one is costs. I don't think we talk about costs as much as we don't talk about kind of the moral things as well. I also don't think we talk about costs, because if you're getting a 15 million maintenance quote, so that just strikes me. But also an interesting difference is that the plans to redevelop. So in Grenfield, it'll become a memorial. And in fact, the Grenfield Memorial Commission has been speaking with people that were involved in the World Trade Center as well. So that's interesting for me. All right, so we're going to move to Nick. Hopefully all the tech works. And we're going to move to Nick from New Zealand, talking about the Leaky Building Crisis, which I'm fascinated to hear about.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. And thank you, Jill, and the ICC General Membership Council for having me today. I hope you can hear me. This is a story which has impacted New Zealand homeowners and the economy equally over many years. So I'd just like to start with an introduction from the Building Research Association of New Zealand, which basically says from the mid-1990s, thousands of New Zealand homes were constructed with design details, materials and methods that resulted in leaks where rainwater could not drain away, frequently leading to damage in the wall assemblies. That was an early quote. The reality is that it was hundreds and hundreds of thousands of New Zealand homes. As well, I now want to give you an overview of the agenda for today. So my presentation reflects both research and personal experience to what I believe is New Zealand's worst building disaster and a resultant significant impact on the viability of New Zealand's economy. I'll cover the background, which I've titled The Perfect Storm, the impacts on owners and other actors such as banks, insurers, etc., the government response, and then move on to the future. Next. So New Zealand's leaky building crisis was the result of a perfect storm, and that's been documented across many authors in respect of this disaster. So through the early part of the 21st century, New Zealand had a prescriptive building system which served it well for residential dwellings. by 1993, following the introduction of the New Building Act, a new performance-based building system was essentially fully effective. That saw designers begin to look at international design trends and materials, leading to a wider range of housing styles. Houses became larger, taller, and arguably more complex, and increased their exposure to the wind and rain environment that New Zealand is famous for. If you've been here, we have very, very green landscapes. Suddenly, house styles and features designed for dry climates were being erected across New Zealand's wet and windy countryside. They came with a range of inadequate features and detailing, including a lack of eaves, complex junctions, membrane roofs, low sloping roofs, the introduction of parapets, and an enormous number of decks secured to the dwellings themselves. So just moving on, the perfect storm included, as I said earlier, an increase of a range of building material availability, many of which were not fit for purpose or used in the wrong situations, and often incorrectly. We saw manufacturers overstating performance. I should actually say manufacturers and importers overstating performance, designers and builders not following manufacturer instructions during installation, manufacturers not testing or not providing the interaction information that was needed for other materials and systems. You then have a situation where builders weren't communicating with designers when details were problematic, and builders taking on the responsibility of redesigns themselves, causing further issues. But the bigger problem was most likely, and has been documented, as the direct fixing of monolithic cladding design during a boom-dominated period of the 1990s. So during this time, thousands and thousands of houses were built using this direct fix monolithic cladding method. Most claddings were EFIS and fibre cement stucco, and soon we saw the catastrophe appear, with water entering through penetrations, inadequate door and window junctions, particularly I think what has been documented is the inadequate flashings in window and door joinery, allowing that water to get in inside the framing cavity where there was no drainage. Next. You combine that with a change to our timber treatment regulations. We have a light building timber structure standard called 3604, and the treatment of timber standard is 3602. Lobbyists pushed for an abandonment of boron treatment for timber for varying reasons, ecological, environmentally friendly. Manufacturers supported it on a reduced cost basis, and there were a number of other players that were encouraging a move away from boron treated timber to kiln dried timber. So from that period of around about 1998 through to 2004, homes were commonly constructed with kiln dried timber framing. And that framing was an exotic softwood, Pinus radiata, milled from fast-growing immature stands, and that product dominated the framing timber in New Zealand. Unfortunately, though, this kiln-dried timber, both the heart and the sap, was susceptible to anobium beetle and fungi rot when wet. And I previously mentioned that the cavity structure, which was later adopted for New Zealand, didn't exist in the framing and cladding environment at that time. Next. So to complete the perfect storm, other elements needed to be added. And I just refer you to the picture on the left of the slide. which is now commonly used in the inspection of weathertight homes. But it details where the inadequacy of the detailing by the designers and the builders were appearing. So as I said before, there was a lack of or poorly installed flashings, insufficient drainage, poorly developed and constructed joints, poorly detailed membranes, particularly in the roof and the outside decking areas, lack of cladding overlap, and inadequately detailed cladding penetrations, particularly around pergolas, decks, and window shutters, very common in the new Mediterranean design look. So the incomplete documentation was another common theme at the time that this tragedy was unfolding. New Zealand had moved to independent certification by building surveyors, and as builders and designers do, they look to save costs, and their documentation was often incomplete and not picked up through the certifying pathway. We also had a situation at the time where New Zealand was going through a building boom cycle, and that created, as a result of some changes to the apprenticeship scheme in the 1980s, a lack of supervision and an inflow of unskilled workers filling the void of previously trained workers. So you start to get the feel that there are a lot of elements that began to shape what was New Zealand's leaky building syndrome. I now want to talk about the impacts, and it's probably important to note that the impacts of the leaky building syndrome didn't really occur across the country at a point in time. It moved from the north down south, where the climate in the north was wetter and humid, and the impacts of weren't immediately apparent in the warmer, drier areas such as the east coast of New Zealand. There's no doubt, though, that research has proved that monolithic cladding systems were overrepresented in the failure of most cases, being around 85%. Kiln-dried timber use from the mid-90s obviously combined with that monolithic cladding, and the lack of cavity made the situation worse. Now, where were the impacts felt? Well, I'm going to start with the owners, and you can see on the graph to the left of the slide that the owners bore the brunt of the remediation process followed by the local councils or local building jurisdictions. So I've defined the leaky building owners in 3 groups, and I just want to take you through my thinking in this environment, because I'm actually an owner of 2 leaky buildings, and I'm a fixer. So the fixers are the people that move very quickly, understanding that they had an issue. Most fixers had the financial capacity to engage designers and remediation experts. The fixing usually involved the removal of the cladding, the testing of the timber, adhering to government regulations in terms of peering back the framing timber a metre from the last exposed area of rot, and then rebuilding the frame and then recladding. There are another group called the delayers, and the delayers want to fix their buildings and remediate their leaky building issues, but they're waiting on finance and building a cash reserve to be able to achieve their outcomes. And the last group is what I nominally call the head in the sanders. They're the people that know they've got a problem, but are not prepared to move on that problem for varying reasons, often mental and emotional, and linked to finance. I can say I chaired one of Wellington's largest remediation projects, and the emotional quotient on homeowners was significant. The building I chaired was an apartment building. Some owners chose to sell at sale prices. Others came to me with serious mental problems. The impact on the homeowner is significant. Over the last 10 years, we've seen New Zealand sellers and buyers become increasingly aware of the leaky building syndrome, and that's led to a departure from the she'll be right approach to when buying a home in New Zealand. So the other group that's probably second on the impacted list are the local councils. New Zealand has a joint and several liability law in terms of the impacts for building developments that go wrong, as opposed to a proportional liability law for buildings. And the joint and several liability law means that builders and designers can avoid payment outside the 10-year limitation period, which is dictated by law, by liquidating their companies and leaving the council as the last man standing on claims to bear the brunt of any declared or proved inadequacy, whether it be negligence on the part of the designer or the builder. The other party involved in terms of impacts are the banks. And as you'll appreciate, the mortgage portfolio exposure of banks is significant in the housing area. And as a result, many homeowners have struggled to remortgage to remediate their leaky buildings due to their limited financial position, but also in respect of the cost of valuation or the financial valuation of the current house. So rigorous pre-purchase building inspection reports have become increasingly essential to gain mortgage finance. And what we have seen is that any weathertight issue is generally drawn an immediate no response from the bankers or a request for wider investigation in terms of a remediation process. The insurers are in a similar situation in terms that they're wanting to protect their exposure. And in terms of reinsurance, homeowners have often been advised that your building is not worth what it was, and therefore we can only insure it for a lesser value. And we started to see weathertight exclusions appear in insurance policies through the 90s and into the noughties. So I'd like to move on now in terms of what were the responses, and I covered a little bit in terms of the bankers and the insurers, but I believe it's probably appropriate now to talk about what were the government responses. And from 1991 through to the current day, we have had 6 prime ministers and 7 governments. And it would be fair to say that the response of those governments has been considerate, but at arm's length, realising that at a government level they knew they had to engage, but how far they were prepared to engage has been an interesting story in itself. So following a lot of media reports through the late 90s, the government ordered some research. It was called the Hun Report, and that research was released in 2002 with around 20 recommendations, which focused on 2 areas. One was weather tightness, and the other was the building sector. In the weather tightness area, they issued public warnings in respect of the risk of collapse, and particularly around balconies and decks, and health warnings in respect of the impacts of the framing fungi that was developing within the wall cavities. They also advised that there will be changes to the external moisture acceptable solutions and durability. In terms of the building sector, there was a big focus on sector performance, particularly in looking at improving the compliance process, a requirement for tertiary qualifications for building inspectors and certifiers, and an improved definitions in respect of the roles and responsibilities for everyone in the sector, starting from developers, going through designers, builders, subtrades, and through to owners. That was followed up. That report was then followed up by a government select committee, which largely reinforced the Hun Report recommendations, and that led to some legislative change with the New Building Act in 2004, but also a reversion of the timber treatment requirement for untreated timber not to be used on exterior walls. They also introduced a weather tightness homes resolution service, but in reality, the government's response could, in my view, have been a lot better. A little bit of detail in terms of the response. As I said earlier, the amendment to the acceptable solution for external moisture came into effect, and also required, among other things, stucco cladding to be used only over a wall cavity. And that cavity principle is now the norm and pretty well in most buildings across New Zealand, most housing across New Zealand. The weather tightness homes resolution service was an attempt to support financially those, financially and administratively those that had leaky buildings, but it wasn't largely undertaken. And I think by the time that service was concluded, around about 173 or maybe a few more buildings, owners had taken up that offer. I think the key, though, is that the 2004 Schedule 1 of the Building Act amended to reinstate the 1993 provision of requiring durability failures to require a building consent. In other words, if you were remediating, you actually needed to go through the consent process. A bit of a view, and many of you that know are familiar with the Vancouver issues, you'll notice that you'll know that an intrusive investigation is required. This is just a picture of a building complex. The net result being at the bottom right-hand corner of this slide, from a Mediterranean design to a total reclad or a reframe, exterior reframe and reclad. So that's the result of what is happening across the countryside in New Zealand at the moment. And that picture in respect of the next picture in respect of what is the future gives you a view of the landscape of New Zealand. New Zealand is dotted with these enclosed building structures while remediation occurs. So what is the future? There's no doubt that, as I said earlier, it is still New Zealand's largest and most expensive man-made problem. 30 years on, it still casts a shadow over our economy and our housing market. The remediation costs have depleted funds available for new home builds, leading to a shortage of housing and housing unaffordability. A report by PricewaterhouseCoopers, the international accounting firm in 2017 estimated New Zealand's leaky building crisis has a cost implication of 20 billion. Offsetting that, the authors of a book called Rotten to the Core, The Story of New Zealand's Leaky Building Home Catastrophe, probably have landed on a more realistic estimate of between 30 and 100 billion ahead of us over the next 20 or 30 years. I put it probably around about the middle ground of 50 to 60 billion, representing in any one year 20% of New Zealand's GDP. So you can see it's a significant issue for this country. And combined with what's happening in our world at the moment, with supply chain logistics, the price of building materials rising, and in New Zealand's case, 20% over the last 2 years, the ability to remediate your home or your apartment and find anywhere between $250,000 and just under $500,000 is increasingly difficult. So what does the future look like? As a final picture, the higher repair costs will prolong the leaky building saga. Potentially there are still 150 to 200,000 buildings requiring remediation. Approximately 400,000 homes were built in the leaky building period with untreated timber and monolithic cladding. And remediation has diverted scarce skills away from new builds and an uptake of unskilled labour on the construction sites, adding to New Zealand's housing shortage and its affordability issues, and potentially creating a new systemic problem, not a potentially healthy horizon in our home building industry. That's my presentation. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I hope you enjoyed it.
Thanks, Nick. Lots of resonances with post-Grenfell property landscape in the UK. But let's move on to Chris, talking about unique challenges in emerging economies, markets, economies.
Great. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure and a privilege to join the panel. And I'll try to make some connections regarding building codes and standards in emerging economies. Next slide, please. So the Millennium Challenge Corporation, where I currently work, is perhaps a little known bilateral aid organization. We're separate from a more familiar actor, the U.S. Agency for International Development, and we're not part of the multilateral donor community like the World Bank or IMF. But we really were created around the turn of the century, just over 20 years ago, or almost 20 years, but the idea was at the turn of the century. The namesake, Millennium, is from the turn of the century. And at that time, in 2000, the United Nations came up with what are called the Millennium Development Goals. They have now been rebranded to the Sustainable Development Goals. And really, it's to solve a lot of the big sticky, persistent problems worldwide, particularly poverty and extreme poverty. So the United States Congress created Millennium Challenge Corporation, or MCC, 2004, with bipartisan support to really add a new tool to the toolbox of U.S. foreign assistance. And MCC enters in a bilateral trade agreement with a partner country. And our programs are grants. They're not loans. So they're not, unlike some of the other aid products from the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund, they're really a grant from the United States. So it's all taxpayer funded. And really the purpose of our grants, which we call compacts, we have another version called the Threshold Program, but it's really to promote economic growth in the partner country, often targeted to the poorest of the poor in our partner countries. And currently our statute has us working with countries that are defined as low income or lower middle income, according to World Bank gross domestic product per capita. But the goal is really to reduce poverty worldwide in countries that have some minimum characteristics related often to governance, free and open elections, and some other values that are important to the United States government. And there are some knockoff effects. For instance, we see some benefits in terms of capacity building, often related to procurement, related to construction worker health and safety, and sometimes establishing bilateral trade relationships between United States or European firms and our partner countries. Next slide. So here's a breakdown pie chart. Because of the nature of poverty at a macroeconomic national level, what what my colleagues do at the Millennium Challenge Corporation is look at a problem through the lens of macroeconomics first. And so what we do is identify what we call binding constraints. They're like the limiting factors. What is preventing this country from growing their economy nationally? We see some patterns, and often they manifest themselves in infrastructure and in human community development, education. So you can see in the top right, kind of from the 12 o'clock to the 3 o'clock position of the pie chart, if it were a clock, is a transport and roads. We in the United States, I for one, at times take for granted our international national highway system and our road networks and rail and multimodal. Many emerging economies and developing countries don't have this, or what they had maybe is from a colonial era, and perhaps the cost of ownership exceeds the financial resources, and the systems may have fallen into disrepair. So we see a lot of infrastructure related to transportation. We see a lot of agriculture interventions because many of our partner countries have some element of agriculture as their primary source of economic activity. We often see needs for water, sanitation, wastewater treatment. Again, these are basic civil infrastructure services that many developed economies may take for granted. Energy, electricity generation, distribution, just going kind of clockwise around. And then some other areas related to health and education, numeracy, literacy, especially in countries that are low income or lower middle income and have suffered periods of civil conflict. Next slide, please. So here's a world map. About 2/3 of the countries that currently are eligible and that have been partner countries with the Millennium Challenge Corporation in the past or currently are on the continent of Africa, about 2/3. But you can see some South Africa, Central America, and Oceania, and Europe. In fact, some of our earliest compacts were in former Soviet republics of Moldova, Armenia, and Georgia. But it does appear that in the foreseeable future, under our current statutory authority that is tied to gross domestic product per capita, we'll be working and continue to work in many, many countries in Africa. Next slide, please. So given this context, how does it relate to the subject of the panel? Well, as you may be aware, and if you're not, it turns out that some of the most vulnerable populations are in the poorest countries, and their vulnerability is often due to capacity constraints, climate change, extreme weather, humanitarian crisis, civil conflict. Many of these countries are just one crisis away from going to extreme poverty, and many members of the population in these countries are similarly just one crisis away. And I would refer the audience to, on the general subject of the topic of building codes and standards in the context of emerging economies, particularly low income and lower middle income countries, to a group that's based at the University of Canberra, closer to where Nick is in Australia. And I'll just quote their opening paragraph because it's so cogent and much more eloquent than I could say. But according to the International Building Quality Center, which has a publication that you see on the slide related to emerging or low-income countries, low-income countries or emerging economies force different building control challenges to high-income economies. Economic capacity restraints or constraints often limit their ability to adopt regulations characteristic of high-income countries and on account of a lack of institutional capacity, sufficient numbers of qualified design and construction actors, the ability of citizens to afford to construct engineered solution buildings that are prevalent in higher income countries, infrastructure such as power, water, sewerage of the kinds of sectors I mentioned, necessary for effective operation and function over a building lifestyle. So the International Building Quality Center advocates on the subject generally of building codes and standards is to look not at a one-size-fits-all or try to transfer or mandate a more developed economic framework towards codes and standards onto these emerging economies, but rather acknowledge that there are kind of bands, and they define them as the engineering or engineered structures, the vernacular, which is reflecting of the local, customs, and then the informal construction. The informal construction might be those informal settlements that we're seeing in many, many urban centers in many countries, just expanding more and more and increasing the vulnerable population. So where MCC works in my group, looking at buildings and other facilities, often related to education, but sometimes related to transportation and logistics, border crossings. What we do is we would fall into the engineered category, which would be more familiar to those of us in the building and codes and standards business, but also elements of the vernacular given the context. It's not so simple as for me to write or coordinate with my in-partner countries to write boilerplate language that, design professionals shall comply with the International Building Code edition 2018. That's just not practical. So what we do is tailor our approach, although we are working towards a framework that is very code informed, and to balance the minimum standards that we would set at MCC as a U.S. government agency funded with United States taxpayers' funds, but respecting the local culture, respecting the role of our in-partner country, the vernacular design traditions, and then the customary means and methods of construction. It makes no sense to try to build a facility of the type that might be totally appropriate or common in one context, but would not be appropriate and would be out of place, and in fact would perhaps not meet the local needs anyway. The second sub-bullet also is something we struggle with, which is in many of these countries, we heard about the regulatory framework. Many of these countries may have a building code on the books, but on the books alone. And there may not be an entity like a Ministry of Building Construction, for instance, that would serve the role of an authority having jurisdiction. And at MCC, as the donor, we are substantially involved in our programs, and we often assume, because there is a vacuum, often assume many of the responsibilities and some of the roles of what a code official or those of us in the design profession might consider to be more appropriate with the authority having jurisdiction. But if the local standards don't acknowledge an authority having jurisdiction, but yet there is a need to protect the public health and safety in terms of design review and oversight of construction for inspections, then the Millennium Challenge Corporation, as a donor, we assume some of those roles and responsibilities. And those roles and responsibilities are also different in emerging economies than we see and recognize in more developed economies. There's a different concept of risk, a different concept of liability. The statute of repose or statute of limitations often are quite different. And there are more and more common than in developed countries and more common than in the United States, an outsourcing of the authority having jurisdiction or the authority that would issue permits to a private sector actor, nominally and in theory representing the interests of the state, but at times maybe not totally fulfilling that mandate. The next bullet would be aspects of cultural and legal aspects that are different, often related to worker health and safety and protecting the public. I work in one of our programs in Morocco where we're improving the safety, security, and hygiene of public school buildings in 3 regions of Morocco. And we were very, very diligent to look at restrictions of work during the periods of time when teachers and students were present. There really was no such sort of OSHA type standard in place in the country in Morocco. And so we imposed that through contracts as acting as a donor, serving more of the role of the authority having jurisdiction. And the final bullet here is really perhaps for discussion in the open forum, is in the context of emerging economies, they have needs today. There are pressing needs that are more basic survival, basic human dignity, human needs. And so preparedness and resilience to a potential scenario of a storm next year might not be top of mind for many of our partners, but nonetheless, we have an obligation to try to address some of these things, primarily related to kind of baking in more resilience to extreme weather hazards, which we will see in these contexts, I believe, kind of baking them into our programs rather than just wait for our in-partner countries to alert us to them. As part of that balance between what they may need versus what's a prudent investment for the United States government versus what might be a smart investment or a low regret investment to increase resilience and resistance to extreme weather for whenever that next natural hazard might occur, in theory, and hopefully to avoid a disaster that might be in the future. That concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Shall we go? Thank you. All right. So, Chris, the thing that resonates with me is in my presentation, I was talking about how you have to bring the worlds of the imagined, prescribed workers down, together. And I can see that happening in a very real way in what you're sharing. So I'm not going to speak for very long at all. There's two things just picking up on the other presentations that I'll mention. So firstly, there's a massive impact of cladding on the property market in the UK. So the remediation costs, because it's not just cladding, so it's revealed way broader issues with, missing cavity barriers, fire doors, terrible practice over decades. Again, the estimates, Nick, I think it's between 15 and 50 billion are estimated to remediate all buildings. A lot of people who own high-rise flats, so leaseholders in high-rise apartments with flammable cladding or where they don't know the cladding, just can't get mortgages. So there's been an enormous impact on the market. And then the second thing I'll pick up, which will link into our next conversation, our next case study with Phil, is there was inequality in terms of who could egress. So the number of disabled people who died was 41% of the disabled people in Grenfield died. And one of the recommendations from phase 1 of the inquiry was to do what are called PEEPs, personal emergency evacuation plans. But the government's rescinded on that. So there's an enormous outcry in the UK at the minute around how do you enable what I call equality of egress. Because a lot of, if you're disabled and you live on the top floor of a high-rise and the fire service are not coming to get you, how are you going to get out? So that's a big issue for us at the minute in this notion of equality. Are you going to introduce? So thank you very much, and we're going to move on to the case study.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Sergio, Nick, Chris, and Jill. It's now my pleasure to introduce you to Philip Rizcala, the CEO of Accessibility Standards Canada. Philip has worked within the federal government in Canada for 33 years. After starting his career with the Federal Fire Commissionary's Office and Public Works Government Services Canada, he worked 20 years leading research and technical teams, first as resource director at the Building Regulations National Codes Unit, and later he became a program director for construction at the National Research Council of Canada. He was appointed as the Chief Executive Officer for Accessibility Standards Canada in 2019. This is a new department within the federal government tasked with developing standards that will become legislation and carrying out funding research to remove barriers to accessibility in many areas, including the built environment, outdoor spaces, communication, transportation, employment, and procurement. Philip is a registered professional engineer in the province of Ontario. He holds a Bachelor of Mechanical Engineering from the Technical University of Nova Scotia and a Bachelor of Science in Honors Mathematics from Dalhousie University. Did I get that right? What is it? Dalhousie University. Please join me in welcoming Philip Rizcala. Thank you. Be nice.
Thanks. Well, thank you guys for sticking around. I don't have slides. I don't generally work with slides because I never follow them. So as Judy mentioned, my name is Philip Rizcala. I'm the Chief Executive Officer for Accessibility Standards Canada. I've been there for 3 years. It's a very young organization. It's my pleasure to be here today and speak to you. So what I'm hoping to do today is kind of touch on a couple examples and then focus a little bit on accessibility. But before I start my talk, and I'll keep to the time. If you can do this when I have 5 minutes left, I'd really appreciate it. I want to ask 2 rhetorical questions before I start. And I always like to do this because it gives me a sense. So first one, has anyone ever been disadvantaged by a curb cut? Now, what's a curb cut? Curb cut is that intersection between the sidewalk and the street, that little ramp that's there. I would suspect the answer is no. Nobody's usually disadvantaged by having a curb cut. Now, if I was to come back and ask the same question, same rhetorical question, has anybody ever been disadvantaged? Let's assume that curb cuts never existed, nobody knew what they were. Now, would anybody be disadvantaged if there wasn't a curb cut on a sidewalk? The answer should be yes. So I can speak personally, just in my office alone, there would be at least 9 people that use wheelchairs or mobility devices that would never be able to actually enter the office, wouldn't be able to go to a grocery store, wouldn't be able to go to a doctor's appointment, wouldn't be able to go to a shopping center because of that curb cut. That 6 inches is like having a 12-foot wall in front of somebody. So sometimes you hear the expression size doesn't matter. In this case, size does matter. So 6 inches, 2 inches, it doesn't matter. You're not going to be able to get over that if you're in a specific type of wheelchair. So this is just kind of gets to the point of why we actually exist. At Accessibility Standards Canada, our mission is threefold. One of them is that we develop standards to remove barriers to accessibility. Secondly, we fund research through our grants and contributions program to the tune of about $8.5–9 million a year that we give out to associations and groups to do research that will then support the development of our standards. And third, we disseminate this information. What's unique about our organization is that as an accredited standards development organization, we can develop a standard. I report directly to a minister. I can then take that standard, whether it's a standard in built environment, whether it's a standard on employment, or a standard for airlines, for airplanes. I could take that standard and give it to the minister and say, I recommend that this go into legislation. And within 2 years, possibly less, it goes into legislation. We have been given power through an act of parliament. So we have a lot of power in what we develop. So in the introduction, Judy mentioned that I've been in government for 33 years. At the 30-year mark, I was about to retire. And then this opportunity came up and I said, wow, you know what? I've spent 30 years, I'm a fire protection engineer, by the way. First 10 years was as a fire protection engineer. And then the last 20 years developing codes. And I've been beating my head because the way we develop codes in our country, in Canada, and I think in a lot of other countries, sometimes is frustrating. The way you get to a solution, the time it takes to get to that solution, and then what happens with that code after it's developed, it's not necessarily what you want to see. You don't want to see something sit on a shelf, and you don't want to see something not applied or enforced. And that became very frustrating. But when I was told that, Phil, you're going to be appointed, the act says that there shall be a CEO with these powers. Do you want this job? I said, well, I think I'll come back and I'll take this job. So because it really gives me great power to actually make a change. And I think we're going to make a change. So we heard a little bit from Jill earlier on. She talked about the Grenfield Towers. So I am going to talk a little bit about it. I do know a little bit about it because when that fire occurred, I was in charge of the cladding testing at our labs in NRC, so I know a lot about what happened there. And you alluded to it at the very end. At the Grenfield Towers, there were a number of people that died. And unfortunately, as you mentioned, those persons or those people that were in wheelchairs or had mobility hindrances or couldn't use the stair for whatever reason, they were most vulnerable. So whether you're on the 2nd floor, 3rd floor, or the 17th floor of that building, if you're in a wheelchair and the elevator is out of commission, you are stuck on that floor. That's just the way it works. You're stuck on that floor. And actually, even if the elevator wasn't affected, the elevator recalls in a fire, and you don't have access to that elevator, so you have no choice but stay put in a fire situation. Now, my personal opinion, this is not the opinion of the Canadian government, but my personal opinion, and I've got years of experience as a fire protection engineer, is that the stay put policy makes no sense. The stay put policy should only apply when you know the condition of a fire and you know you're there, you're witnessing, and you know whether or not you can actually make the call. Otherwise, it's automatically evacuate the building. In this case, it wouldn't have mattered anyway because anybody who's vulnerable, and it could be any disability, but let's just use somebody in a wheelchair because that's the one that comes to mind to most people. If you're in a wheelchair and you're asked to sit on the 17th floor and wait in front of an exit stair to be carried out of that building, you're gone. If there's really a fire that's out of control, you're dead. And that's the reality. And that's the way we actually develop codes today. I do have notes. I seldom follow them, but I'm going to go through them a little bit right now. I'm going to actually talk to you about one situation that occurred in Canada, in a small village in Quebec, which is a French community, a French province in our country, a small village called Ile Verte. In that community, there was a fire in a 3-story residential housing facility, a seniors facility. And 52 people occupied the seniors facility. The fire broke out, and after some time, the fire department showed up. And when the fire department showed up to the site, nobody had started evacuation yet. So by the time the fire department was called to this fire and they showed up, nobody had actually walked out of this building yet. The building was fully engulfed. 32 people died. 15 people were injured. Remember, there's only 52 people there. The one of the people that did make it out with that injury was a staff member. So what came out of this was that there was no training. Nobody was trained to actually evacuate these individuals. These were very, very vulnerable. The majority of them used wheelchairs or walkers or had some sort of cognitive disability. They didn't know what was going on. They didn't know they had to leave. Nobody told them anything. The fire department showed up late, and the staff member had never been trained. They were on the job for 3 years. They had never been trained in evacuation. So whole slew of errors that occurred in this building. But what was really, really ironic, and this is where I was happy that you actually talked about my work with codes, because I want to tell you how bad codes are. And I'm being very, very serious here. I dedicated my life to codes, and I'm disappointed with some of the elements and some of the assumptions that are taken when we develop codes. So the mere fact that this building was built in 1997, it's not extremely old, but in 1997 there was no sprinkler requirement for a residential building. In 2002 there was a very small addition. In 2002 it was required to be sprinklered. So that small addition was sprinklered. They wanted to sprinkler the entire building, but costs and a number of other reasons, they allowed them just to sprinkler that little portion of the building. When the building burnt down, the people that didn't die were in that sprinklered part of the building. Everybody in the non-sprinklered part of the building died. And the sad part is, it was built as a residence. It wasn't built as a seniors home. So it didn't require sprinklers, but because it was a seniors home with people with disabilities, it actually required sprinklers. So had they put sprinklers in this building, they probably would have saved a few more people. I would have assumed more people would have been saved. But that wasn't the case. The sad part about this is that whenever codes are being developed in Canada, and I can speak from experience, I have sat on over 700 technical committees in my life, either chaired, participated in, or managed, at least 700 committees throughout my career. Generally, there's people that sit around a committee, and there's representation from industry, representation from the regulators, representation from the general user group. Very seldom is there representation from the most vulnerable, the disability community. Very seldom are they ever on that committee. So they sit on the committee and they say, okay, we are going to establish a minimum set of requirements for our codes. Everybody's heard codes are a set of minimum acceptable solutions. Codes are not designed as best practice. That's not the case. You're not building a rocket ship to the moon. You're building what's the best, most practical, economical type building you can build. So this group will sit around and they'll say, okay, we believe that we want a 1-hour floor rating. Or let's take a very simple example. For a house, we believe a 6-minute floor rating is acceptable. And how do they come up with a 6-minute floor rating for fire? They say, well, an average able-bodied individual can evacuate that home in about 6 minutes. And so they say, okay, that's where we're going to set the bar. So they take the curve and they say that for 75% of the population, forget about the outliers, we're going to design our buildings. And that, for us, is deemed to be minimum acceptable. Unfortunately, those outliers, that 20 to 30% of outliers, are the most vulnerable. What we're trying to do at Accessibility Standards Canada is take those outliers and actually bring that curve out so you're going to capture about 95, 96, 97%. I'd like to get to 100%. I don't know if we're going to get there. And so we captured the most vulnerable. Because for me, it doesn't make sense that people sit in a boardroom, decide on the fate of an individual. Did you know right now that if you enter a building and you go to the 17th floor of that building or the 30th floor of a high-rise building, you can use the elevator to get into that building. If you're in a wheelchair, the elevator is recalled to the main floor. You're at the mercy of a fireman or woman to carry you out of that building if there really is a fire in that building. That's what's deemed minimally acceptable. The difference between our department and what's happened in the codes is that we are actually designing codes based on equality. So the Human Rights Commission, the UN Resolution on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities states that everybody should be afforded equal rights. So when we develop our codes, we're not saying we're going to change and we want best in class. We're not asking for best in class. The codes are at this level, which is a minimum acceptable. The codes for the accessibility community is probably at this level. All we're asking for is bring that level to the same amount. We're not asking for more. We're not asking the committees to come back and rethink, should we have an hour, should we have a 3-hour floor rating? Should we have this, should we have that? No, we're saying that if people that are able-bodied can exit the building, you should be able to exit the building. Conversely, if people are able-bodied and they can enter the building, people that are disabled should also be able to enter that building. So don't put 2 steps to go into that building and say it's fine. I've been walking around town, I've been seeing signs in buildings, for accessibility needs, please knock on the door. I've seen a sign in this town. For accessibility needs, please knock on the door and you will be given physical assistance to enter the building. That's degrading, to have to ask somebody to get into a building. So we are going to develop standards. Our hope is that we develop standards that meet an equity level, take these requirements, and then because I was the program director at the National Building Codes section, we're going to implement those into our building code. They will be adopted throughout the country. We have a goal that by 2040, it's not a goal, it's actually embedded in our act, our parliamentary approved act, that by 2040, we have to be fully accessible in our country. Fully accessible, not just for built environment, employment, transportation, communication, procurement, a whole number of things. We have to have standards in place and we have to be fully accessible. If we have to be accessible by 2040, that means our standards need to be finished by 2030 so that we can put those into legislation and put them into act and we can start seeing some changes. So we have about 6 or 7 years to go to get this done. And we've been around for 3 years. I started the department with 2 people. I'm up to 68 people today. We've got 13 standards under development. We have 78 projects of research. We spent about $32 million on research to date. We are working at rapid speed, and we will have probably 50 standards done by the end of the 7th year. That's our goal right now. We will have it done, whether we're developing them ourselves or whether we go into partnership with ICC, and we have gone into partnership with ICC and other international organizations, but we are moving at a warp speed. We want to be the leaders in this. I was in Italy last week. I gave a presentation. There are 4 countries that are watching us intently. They want to do what we're doing. And they want us to go there and teach them, how do you get this to happen so quickly? So I've spoken enough. I've hit my time mark. I'm sorry. And I'll stop there. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Philip. Every time I talk to Philip about this, my brain kind of explodes because you're doing so much. But thank you for the inspiring and challenging presentation. Next, we have planned a group discussion activity. So you've all heard a lot of information today, and maybe, hopefully, some of it has challenged your thinking. We want to now give you all some questions to consider from different perspectives. We've put together some questions that address 3 areas of discussion: emerging economies, accessibility and equity, and climate change. All 3 areas of discussion have some fundamental relation to the current or future need for systemic change. So we'd like to ask everyone to break yourselves into discussion groups based on which topic area is of most interest to you. And we'll give you about 15 minutes to consider as a group 2 questions related to your topic area, and those questions are on this screen. Both screens, perfect, thank you so much. And before you start discussing, though, please nominate one person in your group who's going to provide, at the end of this 15-minute discussion, a 2-minute summary of your group's biggest takeaway from the discussion. So let's say in this section of the room, we'll talk about emerging economies. In that sort of back stage right section, we'll talk about equity and accessibility, and over here about climate change. So break yourselves into groups. There's food coming into here shortly, so there is a reward. Besides the CEUs, it's already here. So if you want to take 2 minutes, grab a plate, but please do get into your groups because you will only have 15 minutes or so to talk. But the questions are, the second question in each group is the same. So as citizens and within our varied professions, what could we start doing that might help us learn from and prevent disasters? Each of them within the context of the topic that you're talking about, emerging economies, equity and accessibility, or climate change. And then the first question is specific to the topic. So emerging economies, accessibility and equity, and climate change. Please divide yourselves and make some new contacts. And don't forget to appoint a reporter. This is your 3-minute warning. All right, everyone. We're going to please start to close down your remarks. We're going to hear from all of you, but the good news is that we have this room for another half hour. So you're welcome to continue the discussion after we report out, or you can just eat more cake and network. But if we could get one appointed person from each group to share the information, we're going to start that right now. I think we're going to start with the emerging economies group.
All right. Thank you. Well, we had some great discussion. We did the emerging economies, and a couple of the things that we feel are very important in advancing the adoption of the codes as you move forward would be, first off, acknowledging the culture and the politics of wherever it is you're trying to move the code into, because it's very important to acknowledge what's existing, know what you're up against, understand the economics. You need to understand the organic culture. And then also, as we heard in one of the presentations today, you also have to acknowledge what the specific climatic situation is in that area where you're attempting to put in the code, to make sure if there are changes that need to be made, if there are specific sections that may or may not be adoptable or adaptable,
The beauty of the IBC is, as a model code, it is not intended to be adopted as written. So we got to that, and then also acknowledging that in many cases there's got to be a change in attitude. There's got to be a change in mindset. And how do you do that? You do that with education. So there needs to be education of the population. You need to expose them to the benefits of what the building code can do. Sometimes that may mean exposing them to some of the failures that they've recently been through. And those of you that know me know that I can usually talk until the battery goes dead on the microphone, but I know I have a limit here, so I'm going to go ahead and move on to our second question. And our second question was the same one everyone has. You know, as citizens within our varied professions, what could we start doing that might help us learn and prevent disasters? Well, I think in most cases, we don't really anticipate a disaster. That's why it's called a disaster. If it was something that we knew was coming, we'd call it a planned event. Like Sergio showed, the implosion of the second tower. Well, that wasn't a disaster. That was a planned event. The first tower was a disaster. We didn't expect it. We didn't anticipate it. We didn't plan for it. We weren't on site for it. So knowing that, there was a very, very good comment that got made in our group. And that was, taking advantage of what happens, understanding the forensics, really digging into it. The comment that got made was, never waste a good disaster. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. So that was what we came up with. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can we have someone from the Equity and Accessibility group, please? Huh? Weren't you in that group? You have already been performed.
Okay, so we talked about equity and accessibility. Oh, thanks. What are the barriers? Or, I'm sorry, how could we improve equality of risk exposure among those most vulnerable? What came up consistently among us with all our varied professions was really profit over people, how we see this consistently. Time and again, in every decision, the profit is always placed over life safety and dignity and things that we all want. And if this were built into the process from the start, then it's not going to cost anyone more. If their buildings had to include universal design and the fact that we are all getting older, we all hope to get older. We don't want to die young, and so we want to need these aging in place standards. And for some reason, we have the feeling that we won't get old. It doesn't pertain to us, so it doesn't matter. But really, it has to be through incorporating those design standards at the beginning. And how do you get people to do that? Well, from all of us that have seen how national builders work, or anyone at all in the construction industry, it would have to be through legislation. And how do we get that legislation passed would have to be through the people demanding it, and that would happen through education. And as citizens and within our varied professions, what can we start doing? Well, I guess I kind of went over that as well, but yeah, we really do need to educate. And when I get the chance, I used to work in design, I don't anymore, but when I get the chance to review designs, I will bring up with people, okay, here are some changes you could make right now. They won't cost you anything, that will allow you to modify this design for aging in place. And I think we all just need to continue having that conversation with our colleagues, with our friends and our neighbors. I was just apartment shopping with my son, and he looked at this great little soft story he thought was, amazing. I said, no, you're not gonna live in a soft story, and here's why. But people don't realize the danger, and they don't know that they should be demanding these higher standards for themselves. And so the more we keep talking to people and educating people, hopefully at some point things will start to change. Thanks.
Thanks, Annie Lou. All right, we got Joe coming up already for the discussion on climate change.
All right, so we were discussing climate change. So we had an ex-home builder, some inspection professionals, and some building and code officials. So I think it made for quite an interesting conversation, and certainly there were some experiences from Louisiana, Ohio, Oregon, Australia. So certainly a good conversation. Touching on the first question, what should we be considering? I think the first thing that we discussed kind of was the need to acknowledge and to harness the science. We need to listen to what is being identified as issues, what are the risks and vulnerabilities of specific local places. So not just kind of visualizing it as a holistic topic, but understanding what each jurisdiction or state may be faced with. And I think from that we really discussed, and I thought this was kind of the powerful answer to the first one, was recognize that we do have a problem. If we don't recognize that we have a problem, we're not really going to start moving in the right direction to systemic change. So moving kind of to the second question, and I think this was a good segue, we did speak to learning from our mistakes. We need to implement a holistic approach to building. And I think this wasn't deliberately said or specifically said, but we're only really as strong as our weakest link. We kind of talk to communities where some buildings have been built more resiliently, and then those are impacted by the homes and other buildings that haven't been built to the new standards and criteria. And then we discuss some other things, speaking a little bit about the need for more advocacy and collaboration. This was something I took away from the conversation, but kind of stopped working in silos. And I think that was the nice part about our conversation. We had folks from different avenues and pieces of the sector. And then lastly, kind of just the real need to harness lesson learned and not just what works, but what didn't work, and understanding what sometimes there are unintended consequences and things of that nature. So I think we could have probably kept talking, but yeah. Thanks.
Thank you, Joe. All right, we can go ahead.
So I've been tasked with wrapping everything up in some profound way, but I haven't quite figured out how to do that. So there's a couple of thoughts that I had just through the whole afternoon and the whole session, and then dropping into some of these conversations. I think that the first thing is that we won't solve the problems in front of us with our current way of thinking. So I think the enormity of the challenges that we face globally in all of these areas and beyond mean that that we've reached the limits of our existing thinking. So moving to different paradigms of thinking is hard. It's uncomfortable, it's challenging, and it's incredibly frustrating because we just want to go to what we know and do what we've always done. But if we keep doing what we've always done, we'll just get what we've always gotten. So I think the first kind of charge, I suppose, is to challenge ourselves, to challenge our thinking. And the best way I know how to do that is to think about new questions and not rush to solutions. And in my experience in groups like this, your job is to come up with answers. So that in and of itself takes a paradigm shift, is start being as enamored with the question as the answer. Because it'll take a while to discover what the right thing to do is, and it will take experimentation and failure as part of that process. So I would go those two things, is we need a new way of thinking, and the best access to that is ask different questions and stay in the question and the inquiry versus jumping to solutions. And then the final thing, so this heart, this is a Grenfield heart, and there's 72 stars. So there's 1 star on it for every person that died in the fire. It's my favorite. They do hearts most years. During the pandemic they didn't, but most anniversaries they do a heart of some nature. This is my favorite because of the 72 stars. Is just remember the people. I think it's easy for it to become depersonalized. And remember, I mean, that Richard Millett quote that I read at the end is every decision impacts somebody's mother, brother, daughter. And if we can keep that at the forefront of our thinking, I do believe change is possible. So those are my profound words, and thank you. I found it really, really useful. I really thank the other panelists and case study. I find those fascinating. We'll be following up personally on some of those things, and then over to Judy, and thank you to you and the ICC very much as well.
Thank you, Jill, and thank you to everyone who has stuck it out for the duration. There is the book in the back now if you want to sign up to get your CEUs. And again, this is now meant to be a networking reception for the next 30 minutes. The next ICC annual conference event is the gala tonight. The reception for the gala begins at 6 upstairs, so you have some time if you want to go back and change, or you can probably stay here and eat until they kick you out. And then the gala actually itself starts at 7. So we hope you'll join us for all of that. We hope you'll stick around and continue the conversation, make new connections, global connections. And thanks to everyone who presented and to everyone who joined us.